Now we want to change gears a little bit, pause the idea of intermolecular forces, and talk about what are called organic molecules. So organic molecules are molecules that contain carbon, generally except for the ones that we've talked about or used in like a Gen Chem 1 setting: carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, carbonate anions, just carbon by elemental carbon. But all other molecules that contain carbon are called organic. So why is carbon so important, right? There's 100 elements on the periodic table. Why is there one branch of chemistry for this one type of atom? So carbon is really, really special. The word organic, that word comes from the fact that living things are made up of carbon-containing compounds. So you right now are based around molecules that contain carbon. All living things are based around carbon atom-based molecules. So why carbon? What's unique about carbon? So that's obviously important enough that, if all living things are based around carbon-containing molecules, we should probably learn about them, or study them. But then what's unique about carbon? One of the questions is, why would life evolve to be based around carbon? Well, carbon's useful in the fact that it can form 4 bonds. Carbon is in group 4a on the periodic table, so it has 4 valence electrons. The octet rule says it needs to get 4 electrons. One of the things that means is it's not really good at forming ionic bonds, because that's a lot of electrons to gain or lose. But sharing, that's reasonable. And that means it needs to share a lot of things. So carbon atoms can form 4 bonds at the same time. So that's just kind of a good kind of network. If you think about building big structural molecules, that'd be really good. Another really important and unique aspect of carbon is that carbon atoms form strong bonds to other carbon atoms. So this allows them to form really big chains of molecules. So for example, you can just form straight chains. So, you need to form, say, a big living thing. It needs to be made of big molecules, and those molecules are going to need some length. So carbon atoms can form bonds to multiple other carbon atoms. We're used to maybe thinking about like O2 or Cl2, where it's one atom bonded to one other atom, but there's not a whole lot beyond that. Carbon is really unique that you can make these really, really big molecules. You can branch them because the carbon forms 4 bonds. Even if oxygen could form lots of bonds, it only forms 2 at a time, so that'd be straight lines. Carbon can form branches. Carbon is also unique in that it can form cycles, right? You can form like rings. Those make good building blocks. They're kind of sturdy structures you can kind of stack together. This is why your molecules are made of carbon. They're big, they're structural components. So the molecules that make you up, there's kind of 4 big classes of organic molecules that are biological. Carbohydrates, those are sugars. Those are important. Not only those serve structural purposes, those serve energy-based purposes. Lipids, these are mostly carbon. You'll note there's kind of some odd structures that are drawn around here, some kind of fancy Lewis structures. There's lots of zigzag lines. Those lines are still bonds, like we've learned previously, but the corners are actually carbon atoms. Carbon atoms are so common, you just don't write them. You basically leave it blank where the carbon atom would be, and you only write the other atoms because carbon is so important and it's kind of implied. You can save a lot of time by not writing all those C's. Lipids, that's like fats. So again, energy storage. There's also some other functional uses of lipids. A lot of hormones are lipids, kind of some molecules that do that. Nucleic acids, those are your genes. They store all the makeup information about you. Proteins, you can see this is a really exotic. It has colors, these like ribbons of line. Proteins are massive molecules. There are like thousands of atoms in there. So it's not even worthwhile to draw anything approaching a Lewis structure. So you're just kind of showing the overall kind of gist of the backbone. You can see that really does kind of look like a structure. Those atoms really are arranged in squiggles that kind of look like telephone cords. And so you have that sort of structure to it. And proteins are the molecules that do things in your body. Any sort of change that's happening is driven by proteins. They also are structural, all sorts of things. And it's all based around carbon atoms. And so understanding what these molecules do is really, really important. There's also a lot of applications of organic molecules that have nothing to do with being inside of you. We use them a lot industrially because, again, there's a lot of flexibility with what these carbon atoms can do. You have so much flexibility with the types and shapes of molecules. They're not small. You can get really big molecules out of this. Things like caffeine, Kevlar, acetaminophen, and polyethylene terephthalate. we can see that these molecules are showing up in all aspects of our lives. Caffeine, you probably knew that one. In coffee, most foods you consume, the predominant components of food are either water or then organic molecules. Kevlar is bulletproofing material. A lot of industrial uses for these types of molecules. Acetaminophen is the active ingredient in Tylenol. Medicines are almost entirely organic-based, organic compounds. We put things in us that generally are compatible with people, so organic molecules. Polyethylene terephthalate is the most common type of plastic, recycling #1. So, and vast amounts of day-to-day use as well as industrial uses of these materials. And so that's why we're talking about organic molecules here. We're going to talk about bulk phases and how we interact with these things. It is worthwhile to then know what organic molecules are and how to kind of some basic information about how we talk about these molecules and how we describe them, because they're going to be a lot of the common molecules we interact with in these bulk phases. When we're coming up with Lewis structures for these molecules, it can sometimes feel really daunting because they're really big. And how do you know what they are? So one of the good things to know is that there's usually not a lot of atoms in organic molecules. Obviously, carbon is the main one. Hydrogen is next, most common. Nitrogen, oxygen. And actually, those four right there, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, is like 96% of all the stuff inside of you. Add in phosphorus and sulfur, you get over 99%. And then the halogens have more industrial uses or kind of practical applications. The thing is, all atoms are going to obey the octet rule, except hydrogen, only forms one bond. But hydrogen, halogens, nitrogen, and phosphorus, they all tend to form their expected bonding patterns. Hydrogen and halogens are going to be your kind of outer atoms. They're just kind of attached with that one bond. Carbon isn't. Nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and oxygen can be kind of backbone in that kind of network that the carbon atoms make up, usually kind of attached to other carbon atoms. But nitrogen and phosphorus have one lone pair and 3 bonds, and then sulfur and oxygen have 2 lone pairs and 2 bonds, as you would predict for have their valence electrons, 5 for nitrogen and phosphorus, 6 for sulfur and oxygen. So oftentimes we don't just write the formula for these compounds, just C80, H55, whatever it is. Instead, when we're writing formulas for organic compounds, we use what are called condensed structural formulas. So this is what we want to talk about here, just as a way to kind of get our heads around how we talk about these organic compounds and what it's going to look like when we see them in the context of a problem or something like that. And so the atoms are going to be written in the order of bonding. You'll note, like N-pentane, there's multiple C's written. Those correspond to different carbon atoms in space. And then the hydrogens are just kind of attached as decoration. So you can see there's multiple carbons and hydrogens. They're all written there. And so what this would look like in a Lewis structure is now right up. We can see right there. So this is what N-pentane's Lewis structure looks like. And how we can understand this is that basically we had CH3. There's your CH3. We had CH2. Here's your CH2. CH2, 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 CH3, right? So those carbon atoms were arranged in space. And so that's why, it follows the same pattern. We had this kind of trajectory right here, and then we have the same trajectory right there. CH3, CH2OH, that's ethanol. And so when we're looking at ethanol, we can see that now we have the first carbon atom. We're not going to circle all of them. Second carbon atom, and then the oxygen. And we can see that they still follow in order, and we still write out the H's that we do or don't have. One of the things you'll note that we need to kind of figure out to include is that oxygen atom has lone pairs. Right? It's just written as the O right there, and it has the 2 lone pairs. So important to note, oxygen is always going to have 2 lone pairs that in an organic molecule. It's always going to follow that pattern. We can always kind of also, if we didn't kind of just remember that, we can always know the octet rule. If you only wrote the oxygen with the bond to carbon and the bond to hydrogen, you'd have 2 single bonds, each at 2 electrons. That'd be 4 electrons in the valence of that O atom. It needs to have 8 total, and so it needs to have those 2 lone pairs. dimethyl ether right below it. Looks like this. 1, 2, 3. Again, the oxygen has the 2 lone pairs. There's no hydrogens written next to the oxygen in the structure because in the condensed formula, because there's no hydrogens in the structure. It's just the oxygen that's linking together the carbons. It's also worthwhile to note that ethanol and dimethyl ether are both C2H6O. They have the exact same types of atoms with the relative numbers. That's why we need to use, or that's why we use these condensed formulas to distinguish what they are. So importantly, one of the things we want to kind of circle back to is how these organic molecules, we can understand their polarity. So we can look at their formulas and kind of figure out their shape, their Lewis structures. That would inform their shape, all that kind of stuff. But a couple rules we can use. The first and most important and most uniform rule, any molecule that is only carbon and hydrogen is nonpolar. If the molecule only contains carbon and hydrogen, it is a nonpolar molecule. Does not matter how many carbons or how many hydrogens, it's a nonpolar molecule. If we look at, for example, C3H8 right here, we can see that those carbon and hydrogen bonds are, potentially polar. They're pulling this. They're not very strongly polar, but they're kind of there. But what ends up happening is everything is all stretched out. They're all spread out. And what ends up happening is all of those cancel each other out. One of the things you can kind of remember was this idea of lone pairs. There's no lone pairs on those carbon atoms. So the hydrogen bonds are all symmetric, leading to cancellation and a non-polar molecule. If you introduce something like an oxygen atom, there are lone pairs on that oxygen atom. They take up space and affect the shape of the molecule. You have that kind of bent little feature. It's also a really electronegative atom, leading to the formation of really strong bond dipoles that add up to create a polar molecule. They pull in right there, leading to a polar. There's nothing to cancel that out, right? There's no other OH molecules. Even if there were, they wouldn't cancel each other out. So the presentation of these non-carbon atoms, namely and specifically what we're going to be on the lookout for, is going to be the nitrogen and oxygen. When we have those, it is likely that the molecule is polar. You can find examples where that's not the case. We're not going to worry too much about those. Generally, our rule is going to be carbon and hydrogen only, like C3H8, nonpolar. Carbon and hydrogen with oxygen and or nitrogen, we're going to assume that's a polar molecule. You can safely assume for our purposes. That's it. Congrats on making your way through this first set of videos. There's a homework about this set of videos, midweek 1. It's short, due Wednesday over on Chem 101. Make sure you get set up over on that. Then Wednesday, we will be coming on campus doing lab. You don't need to do any assignments or anything before that. We'll get everything kind of going there. But you will need to wear closed-toed shoes and bring goggles, and you get those goggles from the bookstore as part of the kind of books coverage. And then there'll be a second set of videos later this week. The participation for that will be due Friday. There'll be questions in there. Then there's also the a homework that covers the whole week's, or all the videos from this week, chapter 10 stuff. And then a discussion board introduction, just kind of type in, answering some questions about yourself. That's due Sunday, but you can always do it whenever. There's no chemistry, there's no videos to watch that prepare you for that. Your life will prepare you for that. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can shoot me an email. You can post in the question and answer discussion board. You can bring it on campus. We can also talk there. Text me, call me, anything like that. Otherwise, welcome to the class. I hope this set of videos hasn't been too crazy. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you Wednesday. Bye-bye.